Okay, the focus of this video is to discuss fiscal policy for AP macroeconomics. Fiscal policy essentially is an attempt by Congress, we can throw the president in there too, Congress and the president to influence the aggregate demand curve in many ways. And they can either influence this directly with government spending, or indirectly with taxes and transfers. So the other type of policy that we'll deal with later in the year is monetary policy. That's going to be central banks, and in our case, that's the Fed. So don't confuse fiscal and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is Congress and the president. It's a combination. For example, the stimulus in 2009, the $787 billion stimulus, was actually a combination of government spending, tax cuts, increases in government spending, tax cuts, and increases in transfers. Transfers being things like Social Security payments or unemployment benefits being extended. And if we kind of just remember our old friend, the aggregate demand curve here, and the short run aggregate supply curve, okay, if we get everything properly labeled. Remember, I like you to label or add this to aggregate demand, CIG, and net exports. Fiscal policy is really going to focus on C, focuses on C, a little bit on I guess with business taxes, but mainly C and G are going to be the influence there. And the direct stuff is going to be government spending. You either increase government spending or you decrease government spending. And then taxes and transfers are indirect. You can cut taxes and increase transfers, and that can give people more disposable income. And why that's indirect, sort of like you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. In 2007, they sent home tax refund checks, and a lot of people MPS'd the heck out of them because they were nervous. So if you cut taxes and increase transfers, that increases C, gives people more disposable income. If you raise taxes and lower transfers, that would lower C. Now the other thing you can get into is business taxes, but mainly, and that would influence I, but mainly C and G tend to be the vehicles that aggregate demand is going to move. If you do what's known as expansionary, expansionary fiscal policy, I'm getting a little messy here, that would be increasing government spending, decreasing taxes, increasing transfers, and that would cause C and G to increase. Aggregate demand moves to the right. If you do what is referred to as contractionary fiscal policy, you're trying to slow the economy down. Okay, that would be to lower government spending. It would be to increase taxes, like personal income taxes, and decrease transfers. Okay, and that would cause aggregate demand to shift to the left. And you can see what the impact of both of those policies are going to be. Now, the other shifting that we did in a previous class had to do with the self-correcting from a recessionary gap or from an inflationary gap. And remember, the self-correcting was a short-run aggregate supply shift. As wages and resource prices or input costs become flexible, the aggregate supply curve is going to self-correct you with a shift back to full employment. Fiscal policy basically comes along and is like a government intervention basically into the system. And usually it's used if there's a recession or inflation. That's how they're going to ask you. In theory, you could start from full employment and they could just ask you to do something that you would recognize as fiscal policy, maybe increase spending or increase taxes, let's say, and that can move an aggregate demand curve, and the question can kind of go from there. But if you kind of look at what's going on here, obviously if you're trying to get aggregate demand to shift to the right, you want to select the expansionary options or the blue options. And if you want to get aggregate demand to shift to the left, you're going to select the contractionary options or the red options. Now, don't just assume if they give you a question in which, like, the economy's in a recession, they are automatically going to do expansionary policy. But just understand, in theory, the goal in a recession would be to do expansionary policy to get you back to full employment. So, for example, if you were in a recession, which is right here, okay, and as soon as I start to draw this, you should see that this is a recession. Okay, so this is full employment right there. You're currently operating below full employment. Okay, if you wanted to do, what fiscal policy would you use to solve this? Well, remember, fiscal policy that you would want to do to solve this would be expansionary policy, because you need to get the aggregate demand curve to shift right. Okay, you need to get that shift to happen to get you back to full employment. So what could you do? You could increase government spending, which would be direct. So the government could just decide they're going to spend more money on nuclear submarines or bridges or something, which is a direct injection of spending. Or they could do indirect fiscal policy, which would be to lower taxes in this case, or increase transfers. Okay, give grandma more Social Security money to spend. Okay, more unemployment benefits, that type of stuff. And in theory, that should shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now, if we kind of just make maybe some room on the same page here, if I quickly just kind of resketch this curve, I'm not going to spend the time going through the labeling, but you should sort of at least label some of it here. If you wanted to get aggregate demand to go back to the left here, okay, to get you back to full employment, because this is an inflationary gap. This economy is overheating. It's running too fast. You got to slow it down. Well, how could you slow it down? You could do some contractionary fiscal policy, and that would be to decrease government spending, increase taxes. Okay, so decreasing government spending is direct. We just won't spend as much money on bridges and nuclear submarines anymore. If you raise taxes, people have less money to spend, less disposable income, and if you decrease transfers, they also would have less money to spend. Now, the tax piece sort of happens in a recession and in inflationary times automatically in our country because we have a progressive tax system, meaning as more and more people make more and more income, their income starts to get taxed at higher percentages at a marginal rate, and that's by design. As we enter recessions, in theory, people are making less income collectively as a group. We're automatically keeping a greater percentage of that lesser income, if you will, because we're not getting the higher rate. So the progressive tax system, in many ways, is supposed to be what's referred to as an automatic stabilizer. They don't need to pass new laws about it or change the tax code. It's kind of the way the whole system is designed. Now, this is pretty simple stuff. When you look at it, you're just shifting a curve. Where you feel like it might get a little complicated is if they then start to work in the multipliers that you're aware of already. And remember, the multipliers were a previous video, but the multipliers apply to both spending, in this case government spending, and then the tax and transfer multipliers, which also are the three tools of fiscal policy: government spending, taxes, and transfer policy. So if they give you an MPC of 0.8, that means they're automatically telling you the MPS is 0.2. 0.2 as a fraction is 1/5. Right? I always like you to think this in terms of a fraction. So the government spending multiplier is going to be 5 in this case, and the tax and transfer multipliers, right, are going to be 4. And that's it's just important to remember. Remember, the tax one is technically supposed to be negative, but when you do, a lot of times you do the math, they're going to ask you, should taxes increase or decrease? That's where that negative is going to come into play. So if we now graph this down here, let's say they tell you, and maybe they don't even ask you to graph it, but they tell you that potential GDP is $1 trillion. So that's almost like where full employment would be, $1 trillion. But they tell you this economy is currently producing below, and it's producing at $900 billion. Well, actual GDP is at where you are currently is 900 billion. Your potential is $1 trillion. So essentially, what you have is $100 billion recessionary gap there. That's the difference between the full employment output, which is $1 trillion, and where you currently are, which is 900 billion. So you need to influence GDP. You need to get real GDP to change by $100 billion. And in this case, we needed to increase by 100 billion. So our choices would be expansionary policy, increase government spending, decrease taxes, or increase transfers. And because they gave you the multipliers, they can now expect you to actually give numbers to these three things. Like how much would you have to change government spending, how much would you have to change taxes, and how much would you have to change transfers to get this change of $100 billion. So if you're trying to close a $100 billion gap, and they told you the multipliers, the government spending multipliers 5, well, you just need to solve basically for X there. So you would know you would need to increase government spending by 20 times 5 would get you your increase of 100 billion. If it's taxes and transfers, because that multiplier is 4, you would need to increase transfers by 25 or decrease taxes by 25 to get your increase of 100 billion. So that's how the multiplier can get wrapped into fiscal policy. And that's a lot of the times what they'll ask you to do. So many times on the AP exam, you'll see a graph, let's say that starts in a recession, okay, which is this, or you get eventually into a recession. And they can ask you to do two things here. They can ask you to fix it using fiscal policy. And if they give you numbers, then you got to use, they also have to give you the multiplier. Or they could give you if they tell you that $20 billion increase in spending changes GDP by 100, then they're telling you the multiplier is 5, right? Because 100 over 20 would be 5. But your options here, if you do your expansionary fiscal policy, that would shift aggregate demand to the right. That would get you to back to full employment. What they sometimes do is then they say go back to your original recession and now assume another advisor, let's say, decides to do no policy. Remember, that would be a self-correction. So that would be a shift of short-run aggregate supply to the right. So a lot of the times they might even ask you to do fiscal policy in one part of the question, then go back and start all over, but this time do nothing or take no policy action, or the economy establishes a new long-run equilibrium without any additional interference or any additional policy or any additional action, then you know they're talking about a correction. Okay, if you have any more questions about this video, please ask me about them in class.